Good morning.
Good morning. Yes, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on Caste and the California State University. The CSU system is 23 universities in California, one of the largest public school systems in the country. My name is Ankur Patel, Director of Advancement for Hindu University of America. Our special guests are Nikhil Joshi and Suhag Shukla. I'll give them an introduction. And of course, we have President of Hindu University of America, Shri Kalyan Vishwanathan, with us today. But you obviously may have heard that the California State University system has announced its intention to add caste to the system's anti-discrimination policy as part of a bargaining agreement with the CSU faculty just this last month, right in January 2022. And this policy change is really premised on claims made by that the Equality Lab survey, right? They're trying to pretend it's scientific, but there's so many different faults, and I think we're gonna get into that. And in that survey, in that report that they put together, they claim there's large-scale prevalence of caste discrimination in the United States. And we're gonna deconstruct that, dismantle that, hopefully. So is this just a storm in a teacup that bears no real consequence? Or are there adverse implications and consequences for the Hindu community that will unfold in the coming years as they continue to use caste as a cudgel to denigrate and do whatever they can to marginalize Hinduism? So in this webinar, we're going to look closely at this issue, frankly and honestly, and what is the path forward for the Hindu community? So with that, let me give our special guest an introduction and also give a shout out to some of our other folks who have joined us. Gaurangji from Bay Area, Richmond in the Zoom, Ottawa, is my echo on, sorry about that. Poonamji from Los Angeles, Colonel Kote from Indianapolis, welcome. And now let me introduce Srimati Suhag Shukla, who's an Esquire, a lawyer, attorney. And she actually holds a BA in religion and JD from the University of Florida. Ms. Shukla has helped steer the Hindu American Foundation to being recognized as a leading voice for civil rights, human rights, and religious freedom. She's been instrumental in the development of a broad range of educational materials and position papers and blogs for a variety of platforms. And we're glad to have her here on the Hindu University of America platform to share with you all on this important issue. Ms. Shukla has served on the boards of the Nirvana Center, Mainline India Association, and the YWCA of Minneapolis. She's also a member of the Department of Homeland Security, Faith-Based Security and Communications Subcommittee. Ms. Shukla is actively involved with Chinmaya Mission, serves on the board of Bhutanese American Organization of Philadelphia, and is a thought partner for the Interfaith Center of Greater Philadelphia's Path to Understanding Public Art initiative. And then we also have Nikhil Joshi. He's also a co-founder of the Hindu American Foundation. He's a board certified, he's certified by the Florida Bar in labor and employment law. He holds degrees in business administration from the University of Florida with a concentration in human resources management and a JD from the University of Florida Levin College of Law. Mr. Nikhil Joshi has provided advice, counsel, litigation defense in front of state agencies, federal agencies, and in state and federal court in Florida and outside of the state. Mr. Joshi is also a frequent speaker on conferences and seminars nationwide on various employment and labor law topics. So it's a pleasure to have both you, Suhagji and Nikhilji, today on this webinar. And maybe I'll give it to Kalyanji to give us some context, and we can get into this very interesting topic. I'm sure the chat is going to be filled. Let's try and keep the chat a little under control. If you have questions, put them in the Q&A box, but let's listen to the presentation and not engage in that side conversation until later. But thank you all for joining. Kalyanji, President of Hindu University of America, the stalwart, the steward, the man. Thank you, Kalyanji. Let me hand it to you.
All right. Okay, thank you all. Thank you everybody for joining today. By the way, we should acknowledge that Ankur Patel is a product of the California State University system. So lest we forget, right? So then of course we have a very strong Florida contingent here today. And of course the Hindu University of America is based in Florida, at least registered in the state of Florida. So, I think this is a very tricky issue. Obviously there are people who feel it's no big deal, nothing will come of it. And then there are those amongst us who feel this is a very serious problem and needs a proper response from the Hindu community. So who better to hear from than the legal minds from Hindu American Foundation, right? So they understand the law, they understand the repercussions of this particular move. So let's hear from them first, and then kindly put your questions in the Q&A box. We'll take as many as possible. With that, over to you, Suhaji and Nikhil.
Thank you so much, everyone who's joined us on this Saturday. That's what I find incredible about HUA is that no matter what time of day, no matter how busy you are, everyone logs in for those classes after a full day's work and then also on weekends. So that's a testament to both the programming that HUA is able to offer, as well as the thirst for knowledge that we have within our community. So thank you all for joining. This is indeed a very important topic. And I am thrilled. I don't think it's been quite some time before since I've been able to present with my co-founder, Nikhil Joshi. We went to law school together. So we are shy of knowing one another for about 30 years now. So it's been quite a journey. Sometimes the universe has a reason as to why you cross paths. And there was definitely a reason for the two of us because not only are we close family friends, but we have been on this journey of building an institution and advocating on behalf of the community. So it's really a pleasure to be here with my Rakhi brother, Nikhil. So just a little quick overview on just the format. We have a short presentation that will last about 25 to 30 minutes. And then we'll take as many questions as possible, as Kalyanji indicated. I would ask that for people to pay attention to the presentation. I know getting active on chat is important, but to me, it's the equivalent of talking if you were at a live presentation. So we wouldn't do that. So this way you actually are able to take things in. Of course, if questions come along as we're saying something, use the Q&A feature. But these are really important topics that are going to impact you even if you don't live in California. So it's critical that we have as much as undivided attention as possible. The other thing that I'll say is that some of this may feel repetitious. If you have attended other webinars where I've presented on this issue with other experts in the field, repetition is key to really being able to fully understand complex topics, and new questions might emerge. And so that will also benefit us if you're able to ask even more and more difficult questions so that we can fine tune our approach and our legal arguments in advocating on behalf of the community. So with that, I'm going to share a screen, and I think, is everyone seeing the full screen presentation? Okay, perfect. All right, thank you. So with that, so caste cows karma, it's something we all are all too familiar with, unfortunately. It is the predominant narrative that defines who Hindus and Hinduism are for the public at large. And so today we're going to be talking about caste. Caste, as you all know, through HUA courses, through your own study, and through your own lived experiences, is the most complicated and misunderstood concept encountered when attempts are made to understand India and Hinduism. Yet, caste and caste system have become the primary marker, the exclusively associated topic of Western understanding of Indians and Hindus. So we're going to just right off the bat, for a matter of nomenclature, we know that caste is a complicated and poorly defined concept, but we also don't want to get tongue-tied and confuse people as we talk about what is even more broadly a complex topic in terms of the law intersecting with caste. So we'll be using caste interchangeably with community, both terms which entail a variety of factors such as clan, class, language and dialect, lineage, religion, traditional occupation, and many other highly localized social group markers. So from as early as 6th grade all the way up to our daily news feeds, we see false and negative stereotypes and oversimplifications about caste and a caste system that are perpetuated through a variety of sectors. Higher education is probably the root source. According to Professor Arvind Sharma, there's been over 9,000 books that have been written about caste and a caste system, with theories ranging from its origins to its evolution to its morality or immorality. Then when we look at K through 12 textbooks, caste is probably one of the first things that all American public school students learn about Hinduism. 6th grade textbooks, we did a survey several years ago of Hindu American public school students, and more than 3 out of 5 respondents said that their schools focused on caste and Hinduism, including claims about the religion and the Indian social practice being one, and almost portraying the caste system and discrimination on its basis as being integral to Hindu teachings as well as practice. Most recently, in fact, just last week, we were forwarded a newsletter from a parent in a school district in California, where a school teacher had students go through a deeply racist and offensive exercise of having the students divvy up into 4 groups and stand in different parts of the classroom and then treat and mistreat one another in order to demonstrate the Indian caste system. And then, of course, there's the media. Over the past 2 years, there have been at least 1 to 2 articles per month, if not more, discussing the purportedly widespread nature of caste-based discrimination in the United States. And what I've noticed is that a lot of these are written by writers in India or Indians who have come to the United States more recently. And they don't understand the lived experiences or realities of Indians and Hindus in America. And so they tend to map on their reality and their biases to ours. And then when you have articles that are written by non-Indians, they tend to suffer from perpetuating the same inaccurate and false tropes that they learned from, ding, 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 6th grade. So it's kind of a vicious cycle. Let me move on to the next slide. So now we're going to be talking about how we're seeing caste being institutionalized from college campuses to county policies and what the impact is on all of us. But I'm going to say something upfront because it should go without saying. However, when you look at many of the media reports, they are giving this perverted reportage that somehow HAF or members of the Hindu community who are opposed to these policies are opposed because they want to retain some right to discriminate. So first and foremost, as Hindus informed by teachings of ahimsa, of satya, of samadrishti, equal regard for all beings, of ekatva, the oneness underlying all of existence, as well as our own experiences as ethnic and religious minorities in the United States who have experienced discrimination personally, we oppose all forms of prejudice and discrimination, including on the basis of caste or community, and have fought against them. So we share the admirable goals of protecting the rights and dignity of all people, regardless of their background, regardless of who they are and who they are perceived to be. But we believe that education and enforcement of existing laws and policies are the solution. So if there's any accusations of caste discrimination, we oppose the addition of caste into non-discrimination policies because we want to ensure that the solution to discrimination doesn't lead to more discrimination. So what is this trend of caste being institutionalized? Ankur gave us a little bit of a preview of what we've seen happening on college campuses. So the trend of institutionalizing caste on college campuses is problematic because caste is one of the most persistent and false and negative stereotypes that are exclusively associated with Indians. And so when you start incorporating policies that single out and target one group, it poses a direct threat to the civil rights of that group. And what group we're talking about today is all people of Indian and South Asian origin in the United States, regardless of the caste or community or background or religion that they come from. There's also indications of this harmful trend spreading to corporations, to counties, and to states. So even if you don't live in California, you need to be paying attention to this, and we need to be vigilant. And we'll talk about what steps you can take, even if you don't have a law degree. And the impact on Indians, and specifically Hindus and South Asians, is going to be devastating for generations to come. Because once a policy is put into place, it's not just there for that year, it's there for years to come. So if, for instance, we have CSU that now has made caste a specific category in its non-discrimination policies, alongside categories like race, ethnicity, sex, gender, age, and other neutral categories, caste is not. This policy, and it's also in the contracts that all faculty are required to sign and are bound by, that's going to impact your children who will go to CSU, your grandchildren who will go to CSU, until CSU revokes the policy. So we're talking about long-term impact. So on college campuses, as I mentioned, it's been incorporated into non-discrimination policies. Now, CSU, as Ankur mentioned, is one of the largest state college systems. It has over 23 campuses and 8 off-campus centers. We're talking about close to 500,000 students annually. And by my understanding from faculty members who have started looking at the number of faculty of Indian origin, there's probably roughly about 600 faculty members who will be directly affected by these discriminatory policies across the CSU system. We've also seen caste being incorporated into non-discrimination policies at other universities and colleges, namely Harvard, Brandeis, Colby, UC Davis, and a few others. We also have seen caste being brought up in the corporate sector. Many of you, and I think I was on this platform to talk about the Cisco case specifically. In Cisco, the state of California has sought to define caste as something that is inherent to the Hindu tradition, inherent to Hindu practice. It's also tried to conflate caste with race and color. And so we have filed a motion to intervene on constitutional grounds, alleging that the state of California, in the way that they are going about trying to define caste as all of these categories, which it is not, is violating the Hindu American rights to religious freedom, to equal protection, and due process. There we have a private cause of action in which one John Doe, who claims to be Dalit, is alleging that 2 of his supervisors, also of Indian descent, discriminated against him on the basis of his caste, and Cisco didn't do enough to remedy the discrimination that he's alleging. We have not taken any position on the merits of the case, and I believe we are expecting a hearing sometime in April. So stay tuned on that. We've also seen it pop up in county policies. So Santa Clara County, which is at the heart of Silicon Valley and both home and a place of work to thousands of workers of Indian origin, last year considered adding caste to its non-discrimination policy. So this would have affected thousands of citizens in Santa Clara County, residents of Santa Clara County who either work or live there. We're talking about parents, workers, and children. And we were able to successfully advocate in partnership with a number of other Hindu American organizations, as well as leaders, to explain the legal ramifications of the dangerous step that Santa Clara County Human Rights Commission was considering. And throughout all of this, we worked with, whether it's Cisco whether it's CSU, whether it was Santa Clara County. We've been working very closely with faculty, with students, with policymakers, community organizations, you name it, because this is not something that one entity is going to be able to be successful in pushing against. It's something that's going to require all of us. I would say that it's probably just a matter of time before we see legislation starting to rise at the state level, at least across the country. So it's something that we are very closely monitoring. Nikhil?
Yes, thank you, Subhag Ji, and namaste to all. It's my pleasure to present to all of you in conjunction with my law school partner and very good friend, as Subhag said, Subhag Shukla. And again, thank you for your time being here today. I have to say, what Suhag mentioned earlier about the example that was provided in some school last week, an example of that actually happened to me in 1987 in my world history class in high school, where I was brought up to the front of the classroom as a Brahmin and asked to stand on top of a table to show that we are higher in the structural hierarchy compared to others in the curriculum that was being taught, at least, so that the student body could understand what that meant according to their explanation. And the teacher actually gave me a $5 bill because I was a Brahmin, as opposed to giving it to somebody who was of a different caste. Okay, I never would have imagined that exercise that I was subjected to in 1987 would bring us to this stage in 2021, where we're probably dealing with the most important civil rights issue facing our community, I think, as Suhag has already outlined. And so this is a very important topic that we are bringing to your attention, and it's going to need all of our attention moving forward. What is exactly at stake? Okay, we're talking about what's going on in the California State University system at this particular moment. And I think Suhag has given you a pretty good background on what's happening in the state, right? But it could very well spread, and it probably likely is going to spread. But the issues that are facing us right now in California, sadly and unfortunately, are not without historical precedent. California, as progressive as it is known to be, as liberal as it's known to be, actually has a very discriminatory historical nature to it in terms of some of the laws that have been implemented all the way from the 1850s into the early 1900s that have targeted immigrant communities, laws that would limit Mexican immigrants from being able to mine gold fields back then, unless they paid a fee. That was only targeting Mexicans, to other sorts of laws that targeted Japanese immigrants and Chinese immigrants into the 1920s. Now, the US Constitution, by the way, has something called the 14th Amendment. Okay, and I'm sure most of us are aware of that law and that constitutional amendment. And the 14th Amendment actually gives all of us a great deal of protection. Okay, and so you can go to the next slide if you don't mind. So what is the 14th Amendment and what are civil rights? Okay, civil rights are basically our fundamental rights as Americans. The right to freedom of press, the right to practice our religion, the right to be free from religion if we choose not to practice a particular religion, obviously the freedom of speech and other sorts of fundamental rights that are available to all Americans are what we call civil rights, okay? But they are also our fundamental rights. So when they're fundamental rights under the US Constitution, they cannot be abridged or impinged or taken away or adversely impacted without us receiving due process and without and to make sure that we're not denied equal protection. Okay, so we're entitled to due process and we're entitled to equal protection under the law whenever a law or potential law or policy, especially from a state actor, is going to be implemented. So with that being the case, in order for a state actor to go ahead and implement any sort of a law or policy that can take away rights from any particular minority group, they have to pass what we call strict scrutiny. Okay, you have to have a compelling state interest in order to bridge our rights, our fundamental rights under the US Constitution. All right. Now, the states and the federal government can implement laws that give categories or classes of individuals protection from discrimination, which by example, we have up on the screen, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination on various backgrounds and categories such as race, religion, national origin, color. There's also iterations of the Civil Rights Act that prohibit discrimination on the basis of age and disability as well, okay? States across the country have implemented similar laws and statutes on the books that prohibit discrimination on those same categories. So these are what pass muster under US constitutional law because they have provided due process and they're providing equal protection to all folks and on the basis of these protected categories. Now, just so you understand, what is due process? Due process means that we must receive notice and an opportunity to be heard, give a voice to issues that have risen up that might lead to legislation or a policy going into place that could abridge our rights or impinge upon our rights. Okay, so we must have notice and we must have an opportunity to be heard. Okay, once that occurs, then equal protection must be ensured for all Americans, and it can only be impinged if a high governmental standard is met in order for that law to then come into effect. All right. So discrimination itself, which is at the bottom of the screen here, I think most of us would understand. Some of us may have actually experienced during our life here in the United States, but it's when one particular group or individual is targeted unfairly based upon some particular characteristics, such as our gender or race or religion, sexual orientation, disability, age, or something along those lines. Okay. All right. Next screen. All right. So look, we know that living in the United States, as almost 250 years into our existence, we strive to reach certain ideals of non-discrimination, equal protection for all, and it's a tug of war for all of us. And the progressive mind of this country certainly feels like no one should be targeted for any reason, and they're looking for reasons to target people. All right. The sense that we're getting from what we're hearing in California is that we are now going to become a targeted group. And the irony of the fact that we're going to be targeted is, and we're going to get into later in the presentation, is based upon stereotypes and false narratives that usually are prohibited to be even considered in order to protect a category from discrimination, yet they're going to use those same bases to discriminate against us. So with that being the case, the addition of caste, why is it discriminatory, right? You may be asking, okay, clearly I don't think any one of us want to or would condone discrimination based on caste. Suhad said that at the very get-go. No one wants discrimination to be based on any category whatsoever. It should be based, performance should be based on merit, admissions should be based on merit. Whatever the case is, it's based upon who you are, not upon some sort of category that has no bearing upon the reasonable judgment of whether someone is meritorious or not. So what is going on here? Clearly we're being singled out. Okay, that's why this is discriminatory, because caste in and of itself comes from the subcontinent of India, and most particularly Hindus, right? It's targeting us. The notion of caste, the discussion of caste comes from there and is focused just on us as a community. So that is why it's discriminatory on its face. And that's why we have to be mindful of this as we move forward through this conversation, how we're going to address this. Because if we don't address this now proactively, the ramifications of our silence are going to be humongous. All right, so recall that I talked about equal protection and due process, right? The 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. When government acts.
Nikhil, you're on mute.
I think you accidentally muted yourself.
I apologize for that. Okay. All right. So Recall that I talked about the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution, right? So that provides due process and equal protection. When the government acts as a state actor, any action that the government takes or an entity of the government, such as CSU, the California State University System, through the collective bargaining agreement that they've implemented, when they take action to target a group, they've got to meet that high standard that I talked about earlier in order to pass the threshold for equal protection and due process. And without getting into the details of what that means, basically the government cannot impinge upon a particular community's legal rights to due process and equal protection, meaning we cannot be treated differently than any other group, any other person in this country, unless they meet a very high standard, which is called strict scrutiny, where the government has to establish that it has a compelling state interest. Okay, so compelling is pretty substantial in the legal context. We don't give a lot of examples of it today, not to bore in details, but they can't just say, hey, we think that this is going to provide some sort of safety to a community. That's not enough to meet that standard. There's got to be evidence. There's got to be historical proof. There's got to be, disclosure of need for this protection to be afforded through this implementation of law in order for the law to then be implemented. And so when you look on the left side of the screen, okay, you see race, national origin, color, religion, gender, sexual orientation as examples. These are what we consider to be facially neutral because the government clearly has established a compelling state interest for protecting folks from discrimination based upon these categories. And why is that the case? Because there's clear historical evidence, complaints, videos, shocking videos of what happened, especially in the racial context, some in the religious context, obviously gender discrimination. You don't have to go very far and deep to find evidence of categories where folks have been targeted on these bases historically to show the need for the government to take action so they can establish the compelling state interest to then implement a policy, statute, or law that then protects these categories, okay? So that is what we call facially neutral. They're also, generally speaking, generally immutable characteristics, right? Your race is not going to change, they're traceable, your national origin is not going to change, your color is not going to change, religion, I guess you could change, but for the most part, gender and sexual orientation, although gender now you can alter too, but for the most part, these are immutable characteristics, okay? Flip to the other side of the screen on the right. Okay, applying the 14th Amendment principles for due process and equal protection to that particular category, and it doesn't take a legal genius to figure out that there is no historical basis, at least in this country. We're focused right now in California, but we're talking about the United States and the US Constitution. There is no evidence, there's no historical basis for going this route at all, right? So with that being the case, on top of the fact that caste in and of itself, and we'll get into this particular topic a little bit more later in the presentation, is not necessarily immutable. For a lot of people, it's not even known, okay, whether or not they have a caste or not. So for the government, the California State University System, the state of California, take the actions it's taken, it clearly does not pass muster under due process because they can't establish that we were put on notice, given a chance to even address whatever complaints, concerns that may have led to the need for this, alleged need for this policy to come into effect, or CBA, collective bargaining agreement. But beyond that, it's clearly not passing muster under equal protection. They don't have a compelling state interest to go that path. So on the screen, you clearly see the distinction right here as to why our community is being facially targeted, okay, by this particular movement that's going on in California. Irrespective of whatever and however caste may be looked at and maybe subclasses in India, okay? And we understand that there might be subclasses and different classes and some protections for certain castes in India. That's not what we're talking about here, because here caste is combined as just all classes of caste in one category. So with that being the case, how can you even enforce such a thing, right? So if it's facially discriminatory, And that is why we have to be on high alert for what's coming next.
Thanks, Nikhil. I'm going to talk a little bit about discriminatory intent before Nikhil, I hand it back to Nikhil to talk about implementation, and we'll go a little bit quick so that we can take questions as well. So, Nikhil talked a lot about evidence, and this is where, in the absence of evidence, we can arguably see discriminatory intent from the viewpoint of those decision makers and those policymakers who implemented this policy. So one, there's an underlying all of these policies at CSU and other institutions is the presumption that Indians and South Asians are so bigoted or so problematic. Now, keep in mind, we are 1.3% of the entire population of the United States, that we are so bigoted and so problematic that one, we require a special policy that applies only to us, that opens us up to ethno-religious policing and monitoring, and that subjecting us to that ethno-religious policing or monitoring in a manner that no other ethnic or religious group is subjected to is somehow justified. So how do we know this? We know this because none of the institutions, specifically CSU, have been able to provide evidence of any complaints of caste-based discrimination having been filed. They have not been able to answer that if any cases were filed, why existing policy failed to provide protection or redress, because categories like national origin have been interpreted by the courts to include factors like ancestry, descent, language, culture, accent, all of these things. So as Nikhil was talking about these facially neutral categories, they are broad and they don't necessarily implicate any one group. And so the courts have been able to, what the power of these broad categories is that they can continue to evolve as our country becomes increasingly diverse, so that religion doesn't necessarily have to be discrimination between, say, a Christian and a Jew, or a Muslim and, a Christian. It could be within the religion, say a Sunni and a Shia, or a Protestant and a Catholic. That is the strength of having these broad categories, so that we are able to provide a broad umbrella of protection, as opposed to going down a slippery slope of getting into specificity. What specificity does is that as much as it appears to be inclusive, it actually becomes exclusive, because those who are not specified then may be left without protection or redress. So going back to the lack of evidence, we also know that if you're going to pass a policy, you're going to have evidence. And the fact of the matter is that the California State University, or any of the other universities that have passed these policies, lack credible evidence. Not only do they not have what you might want to call anecdotal evidence of their own experiences on their campus. I think it was an article on Harvard where the person who's tasked with being the spokesperson or the PR person for the university said, well, yeah, no, we haven't actually had any cases yet, but this is an important step towards diversity and inclusion. That's not how policies are made. Policies should not be made in the absence of evidence of a problem. Policies should not be implemented in the absence of or rather in the face of existing policies that would already take care of any claims of discrimination without actually discriminating against a particular group. So we do know, however, that the one group's data or information that many of these entities, and especially the media, have been relying on and parroting without any due diligence, is that of Equality Labs. So what is Equality Labs? Equality Labs is an activist company. It identifies as Ambedkarite, and it has created the illusion of a problem by putting out a survey and its findings. It has then aggressively pushed for policies to address this purported problem. And the way they've been successful is that they are plugged into an ecosystem of scholar activists who basically allow them backdoor access. And then this same company stands to profit with the trainings that it's ultimately going to offer, and it offers today on caste supremacy. So, what's really important is taking a look at this survey itself. First of all, when they did their outreach, they did not reach out to any of the mainstream cultural, linguistic, and religious organizations representing thousands of Indian Americans and community members. They reached out to their own ecosystem that shares in a particular ideological view, specifically about Hindus, seeing them and seeing the tradition as being inherently bigoted. So the survey is imbued with a variety of biases and quite frankly, hatred. I would invite you to read an article that I wrote. I'll try to plug it in when Nikhil is talking on the next slide. But basically, this survey perpetuates the most noxious and false tropes about Hinduism, again, conflating discrimination as a core Hindu practice and belief. It promotes a contradictory narrative about Buddhism and Sikhism, developing as traditions that were opposed to or against the Hindu caste system, but somehow caste still exists in those communities thousands of years or hundreds of years after their development, but somehow it's still the fault of Hinduism, a tradition that technically they rejected when you look at the case of Indian Muslims and Christians, but somehow it's still the fault of Hinduism, even generations later. It also portrays common practices, Hindu practices, as somehow signaling of casteism. So things like going to the temple, things like practicing vegetarianism. So while a average white American student who is a vegetarian and is maybe part of the vegetarian society is safe, now a college student who's Hindu who happens to be vegetarian could possibly face accusations of being, creating a hostile environment because they're talking about their vegetarian lifestyle amongst friends, and someone who's not feels triggered as a result. This same group has also portrayed our most sacred holidays like Holi and Diwali falsely as being casteist holidays. So imagine the impact now on students, where here's the group that had the backdoor access to the administration, that duped the administration into thinking there's a widespread problem. The administration doesn't reach out to the stakeholders who are going to be directly impacted by this. And this is the same group that has portrayed their holidays as being casteist. How safe are students and faculty at CSU going to feel in celebrating their holidays and feel that it's okay without having this implicit bias now that's been entrenched and institutionalized in their policies against our community, that we are somehow just imbued with casteism and that we discriminate and mistreat people on that basis. So we know that the data that Equality Labs has presented is falsified and manipulated. How? They threw out responses. First of all, they did not reach out to a fair and representative sample. Second, they threw out responses in which people didn't identify by a caste. And we know that probably from our own lived experiences, as well as data from surveys like the Carnegie Endowment's recent study on Indian American attitudes, that caste identities begin to dissipate with generations. So take myself, for instance. I was born and raised in this country and did not know about what caste community we came from. And in fact, similar to Nikhil's, my experience was not as bad as Nikhil's. I was not made to stand on a table. That is horrible on every front. But I was made to stand up in my ninth grade world history class, where my white Caucasian teacher asked me what my caste was. Because I was not able to answer her question, my homework was to go home and ask my parents. So these are experiences that many of us as second generation face, and ones that, of course, my children and my grandchildren hopefully will not face if our efforts to improve textbooks are slowly but surely successful. So what data do we have? We have data from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. This was a survey that was, or a study that was conducted by researchers from Carnegie, from the University of Pennsylvania, as well as Johns Hopkins. And they found that while more than half of Indians reported facing discrimination on the basis of color, gender, and national origin, instances of caste-based discrimination were exceedingly rare. The number that they had were 5%. Now, is this data perfect? No, every survey is going to have its shortcomings, but at least this one has been conducted in a manner that is scientifically grounded. And it was also conducted in partnership with YouGov, a statistical firm. Now, amongst that 5%, one of the flaws of this survey, I'll just put out there in the interest of transparency, is that they asked the caste question only to people or respondents who identified as Hindu, knowing full well and acknowledging that caste identities do exist amongst Christian and Muslim communities. So at least from my conversation with one of the people involved in that survey, it was a matter of resources and wanting to get the survey out in time for the 2020 election, which it was important because there isn't enough data about our community. So in that 5% that reported having faced caste-based discrimination, there is something confounding about the statistic because, 5% is still someone getting discriminated against, and obviously that's wrong. And existing policies should provide them, or they should be pursuing existing policies to get redress and to have their cases investigated to see indeed whether discrimination occurred. But amongst that 5%, half said that it was non-Indians who discriminated against them on the basis of caste. So clearly there's some misunderstanding in terms of what basis of discrimination these individuals had faced, because how would, if even Indians don't know one another's castes, how would a non-Indian know the caste background of another person? The other thing is that little over half the respondents of that survey did not identify with a caste. And amongst those that do, there was a generational shift. There was a marked decrease amongst those who were born and raised here. And I want to be clear here that just because you identify by a caste there's not a direct causal link with discrimination. So, Nikhil?
Yeah, absolutely, Suhag. And I'm glad you brought that up because, again, this is, it's such a folly to even go down this exercise of trying to define caste. It's incomprehensible, it's incongruent. Everyone has their own views on what caste is or not. And even if we practice certain things that has nothing to do with caste, people want to imply that it does. Because there's just no way that you can put your hands around this and come up with some sort of definition or category that would be reliable and consistent and credible in order to even be uphold a standard. So look, again, so if we're even going to go down the path of implementing a policy against caste discrimination, how do you do that, right? When it's clearly based upon stereotypes. I think everything that Suhag just explained about the survey that was conducted and the legitimacy or illegitimacy of that particular survey, just that alone helps explain loudly and clearly that whether there's an agenda or not behind it is immaterial at the point. The reality is you still can't come up with anything that's meaningful or definable and strict. So what that does then is lead to this implicit biases that we've been talking about today, right? And that bias, just as the Equality Lab survey helps explicate and expound upon, is worsened because these are the people who are now providing the data that's supposedly support the need for there to be a policy against caste discrimination. And those who are unaware, those who are not with sufficient knowledge of how to address the issue could be put in a difficult spot when it comes to being faced with a policy that they may be subjected to if caste discrimination is in fact implemented, in companies, not to mention at the state level or the governmental levels. Next slide. So again, we've talked about this, right? It's so complicated, so misunderstood. There is no one definition. You could have hundreds of people in front of you and everyone's going to come up with their own version of what they think caste means or does not mean. So when you're put in a position, at least in this country, the way the Constitution applies in the context of due process and equal protection, you cannot uphold those constitutional standards and tenets with our community if you impose a caste discrimination law on us that has no definition. Okay, there's no way. That, in my opinion, that's unconstitutional on its face, and it's probably worth a fight all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court if we have to get there. Okay, because that's not, there's just no way to hold people accountable if there's no different definition behind it. The challenge, though, is, and we've alluded to Suhag's example from her schooling days, mine. You know, we've had so many people have examples of this that they can convey, right? There's a gap in knowledge, right, between what we have learned or what caste supposedly is India and what people are taught here in the West. And that knowledge gap, that knowledge vacuum is being filled with people who either have an agenda or with just stereotypes of what people believe our culture is about, our traditions are about, and what caste is about. So when we allow people to fill that vacuum, you know, we get to the point now where now this stereotype or this misconception of there being some sort of structural hierarchy or there being some strict definition of job duties for those who are raised in India that we have to perform or do if we're part of a caste, now becoming part of the common culture and knowledge here in the West. And now people are trying to take advantage of that. So we do have to be mindful of that folly, and we have to address that. Okay, and that's going to be very important. Like we said earlier, facially neutral, there's a historical context. Facially discriminatory, which is what we're facing here, there's not. Okay, and when you simplify it and get to that stage, you realize, how can we then even go about implementing anything like this to put structure around some sort of definition of caste? We don't have any identification behind it. Is the government going to compel us, just like they did with the Japanese when they were in internment camps, to have a card to designate who we are, what we are? You know, you can't do things like that, right? So I mentioned, she's in a mixed marriage. She's not from a Brahmin background. Her husband is. My father is Brahmin. My mother is not. We practice traditions of both. So what are we, right? You don't know. We don't know who we are. We practice what we practice. We practice what comes to us naturally and what we would like to do. That does not have anything to do with caste. Yet we could be in position of having to classify ourselves accordingly if this sort of a law keeps moving down the pike. So it absolutely does matter. And, you know, part of the challenge for our community, and so I was going to address this on the next slide coming up, but part of the challenge for a lot of our community is that they feel that they're disconnected from this issue because they're not always dealing with it. And what they don't understand is if we don't get involved to attack this forcefully now, the impact this is going to have on future generations of our own community. We're a very successful community. A lot of us have reached the highest levels of our organizations, whether they be universities, you know, businesses, obviously the most famous companies in this country that we know of, the tech industry. And I think because of that, and because we have a higher profile, right? Indians and Hindus, whether they're Hindu or not, but certainly Indians have a higher profile, we've become a target. And that caste discrimination, if this gets implemented into even corporate culture, and I'll let Suhag take the next slide, it's important enough that those executives, those people at high levels need to be mindful of it, because they could be targeted for reasons they have no idea about, because caste is now prohibited as part of some company policy. And so it's not something that we should just slough off as liberalism in California or the Northeast in Boston or wherever this is happening. This is something that is going to percolate over time. And generally speaking, and I think Suhag mentioned this at one of her points, but it is a truism. Laws that start in the Northeast and in California slowly become part of the culture across the country. Okay, it may take a generation, but they do. So we do have to be mindful of that and be aware of why this is important. Okay, Suhag.
So this is one of the common questions. We're almost done with the presentation. This is one of the common questions that comes up. So if we're not discriminating, does it really matter? Of course it does. First, as Nikhil mentioned, whatever happens in California in terms of regulations usually spreads to the rest of the country in a matter of a decade. Second is that regardless of whether you ascribe to a caste or you or you don't know, this policy still views you through a lens of being an inherent liability in terms of propensity and discrimination. And most importantly, civil rights are fundamental. So if a campus, if a state, if a corporation is implementing a policy that violates one of our fundamental rights, it matters. This, to me, this question is the equivalent of asking, well, if I'm not committing a crime, so what if the police tap my phones? No, that's not what this is about, because as much as the civil rights are about our rights and responsibilities, there are also limits on state power. And so it's important for us, if we want to live and thrive in a free society, that we stand up against this. Of course, discrimination is wrong. If it's happening, we need to apply existing policies to ensure that people are not mistreated on the basis of who they are or who they're perceived to be. But that does not mean that we open the door to making our community and only our community vulnerable for additional policing, additional monitoring, and eventually, because of implicit bias and because we're seen as carrying some special liability, ultimately it means, well, let's not hire Indians anymore. It becomes a silent form of discrimination, a silent form of otherizing that we cannot afford as micro-minorities in this country. I've already gone over this. What is the solution to caste-based discrimination? If anyone is facing it, as we saw from the data, it seems that somewhere less than 5% allege that they have faced caste-based discrimination. The key for institutions is to educate their students, their faculty, their workers on the strong and comprehensive policies that already exist. And they exist in a manner that protect equal protection. They protect due process. They are laws that are there to provide a broad umbrella of protection without singling out any one group for mistreatment or for unequal treatment. There is obviously no agreement as to what caste entails. And so categories like national origin or ancestry, which already cover, as I mentioned, characteristics that would be considered associated with caste, like perceived birthplace, ethnicity, descent, culture, heritage, or language, all of those can be encompassed through national origin. And then what can you do? So, all of these interventions, as much as we would, or rather all of this disturbing trend, as much as we'd rather it not be here, they are opportunities for us to learn what our rights are and to stand up and speak out against this kind of wide scale violation of civil rights that's about to occur. If you are a worker, if you're on campus, seek out opportunities to get involved in your diversity and inclusion programming. Educate your friends and neighbors about our cultures and traditions so that we can slowly but surely dispel false stereotypes about us. Speak out against discriminatory moves that endanger your professional and personal security and well-being. That's what faculty at CSU are doing, and we're working very closely with them in exploring all legal avenues. Specifically on the topic of caste, we need to learn our history. We need to learn the scholarship that's out there. There are a number of tremendous scholars, ranging from Nicholas Dirks, which I know comes up in a lot of our HUA materials. Kundan Singh is doing a lot of work on that. Vishwa Adluri, Joydeep Bagchi have done work on this. Prakash Shah, Jakob de Roover. There's a number of scholars, CJ Fuller in the UK, who provide the complexity of caste and also talk about the history of how the British intervention in this has led to this entrenched false stereotype that we're dealing with today. And you can also visit our website. I plugged in that resource earlier. on some of that introductory material on the history of caste and also what exactly caste entails. So with that, I'll end my screen share. And Kalyan, I know we went a little bit longer on the presentation than anticipated, but we can take whatever questions you have time for.
Great. So I'm going to ask a few questions, and then we'll maybe take a few from the Q&A box.
Mhm.
Okay. So, so the very first question I have is that, as HAF, right, the premier organization in representing Hindu interests, how are you responding to this challenge that is being thrown at us at the moment? And what kind of support do you need from the Hindu community at large?
Great question. We are tackling this issue on every front possible. We are educating the community on the topic through webinars like this. We are about to launch a program called How to Talk About Caste, because this is one of these topics where it just becomes a vicious circle. We know that as soon as someone who's not Indian or not Hindu brings up the topic of caste, there's this inherent idea that, oh, this is that horrible problem, your version of racism that you have in your community. And so you can talk about all these lofty ideals about oneness and peace and yoga and whatever else, but what about that? Right? And people get tongue-tied. And the fact is that we don't know. As Nikhil said earlier, you can talk to 100 people and all 100 people will have different answers to what caste exactly is. And this is not just amongst lay people, but also scholars. There's no universal definition, no agreed upon definition on what caste is. So this program that we're launching in March on how to talk about caste is one that's intended for community members to practice, to first learn about the history of caste and nomenclature, but then also gain comfort in talking about this in a manner that acknowledges, prejudices and discrimination that may exist in Indian society as they exist in every human society, but also talk about it in a way that is grounded in the various aspects of, say, Hinduism that are oftentimes misinterpreted or conflated with this idea of caste in a more confident manner. So that's one thing. In terms of advocacy, we are working with other organizations on the ground and community leaders when it came to pushing back against the proposal in Santa Clara County. That was key to our success. Because we have full-time staff and we've been able to cultivate relationships with members of the government. So when things like this happen, there's already trust built between us and decision makers. They also respect the fact that we do have lawyers on staff and amongst our co-founders and our larger team. So we're able to explain to them, not really get caught up in, oh, well, this is the history and blah, blah, blah. That's important. Absolutely. However, what is the implication of this today? Part of the problem about the caste conversation is that you have this idea of this rigid pyramid that supposedly existed in ancient times, which it didn't, and now it still exists in modern times. And that all that history is obviously important to cover. But regardless of what the history is, this current trend in policymaking violates the US Constitution. And that's black and white. And that's where we kind of start the conversation.
So Suhag, since it violates the US Constitution, right, there ought to be a legal response to this.
Mhm.
And what I'm hearing is you were reasonably successful in your intervention with the Santa Clara County. So is there a similar intervention possible with the California State University?
Yes. So there's two interventions. For one that's pending or hopefully will happen. And the second is already in progress. So when it came to the Cisco case, we filed what's called a motion to intervene on the grounds of the manner in which California is going about trying to define the caste system. For CSU, we are working closely with faculty and we are interviewing different law firms already to help faculty and students protect their rights against this discriminatory policy that has now been made official.
So there is there
That takes resources. Sorry, real quick. And that takes resources. And that's, all of the work at HAF. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. We've been able to do what we do as a result of course, the fantastic staff and leadership that have the requisite subject matter expertise, but more importantly, as a result of support that the community has given us for well over 18 years.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think that point needs to be underscored and highlighted. I think in terms of contributing financially to the Hindu American Foundation and other Hindu organizations, there's a lot more that the Hindu community can do than it's doing today. Now, I am hopeful, Suhag, I'll tell you this, that considering the implications from an employability, labor law type of ramifications that I'm hearing in this conversation, right? There should be a lot of wealthy Silicon Valley Hindus who ought to be interested in supporting this particular matter as much as they can. There ought to be. And I am hopeful that more people can participate in this. Now, here is another question, right? This policy that the California State University has now adopted, can it be challenged?
Absolutely. Nikhil, do you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah. So yes, to answer your question, yes, it can be challenged, and that's one of the items that's under consideration by HAF in terms of how to go about that and the law firms that are being interviewed. So those are points under consideration, but absolutely, because that, without getting into a lot of details as to some of the efforts that are being undertaken behind the scenes, we need information, but it's yes, it can be challenged.
Okay, great. That's good to know. And I think once again, that would be a very important move on the part of the community to not take this non-seriously and casually and just let it kind of roll over us. So one more question. With this kind of policy in place, right? Suhag, you put up a slide saying if you're not doing if you're not practicing discrimination, if I'm not discriminating against anybody on the basis of caste, how does it matter to me if there is a policy somewhere which says, caste-based discrimination is being now policed in some manner, right? So, I just want to elaborate a little bit of that. What could be the risk? Here I am, I'm a simple person. I don't discriminate in my everyday life against anybody on the basis of caste. And all of a sudden, somebody accuses me of engaging in caste-based discrimination. It comes right out of the blue. It's in my blind spot. I never saw it coming. And now I have to defend myself and I have to prove that I have not discriminated against X or Y. So let's talk about this particular scenario and what kind of implications it carries for our community.
Sure. So just in terms of, being accused of caste-based discrimination, that could happen regardless of whether caste is specifically a category or not, right? Yeah. And the argument that we're making that if that is happening, if someone has been, then it needs to go through the same investigative protocol that any other claim of discrimination occurring for national origin would go through. And that's up to then the investigating body, whether it's, first at the campus level, maybe in the employment sector, it would first be what's internal in your company, and then perhaps your state Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Nikhil has more experience on this. But the problem is that when you have caste is essentially a huge departure from well-established legal principle. All of the other categories are universal, facially neutral categories. So let me give another sort of parallel. Let's think of classes like amphibians, reptiles, and mammals, right? Now, all of a sudden, if I say, you know what, we need to add dogs. Well, you already had mammals. So now what makes dogs so special? You know, say this is, these categories are on like the danger that these different classes pose on some plant or something, right? Now, all of a sudden you have dogs that's separate from mammals. Now you might have a protocol on how you're going to judge various allegations that come against these other three categories, but now you have a special category. Oh, well, dogs must somehow be more dangerous, more harmful, right? You're creating already, someone doesn't even have to have met someone who's of Indian origin to know that, wow, this university, I'm new to the HR department. I joined this department and I'm getting my training, and they're like, oh, here are the categories that we look for. And I see caste and I think back, oh yeah, caste is that thing I learned about in 6th grade. It's about Indians and Hindus. They must have had a horrible problem on this college campus because of Indians and Hindus. So I better, if I ever get, even if no one tells me this in my training, I'm thinking in my head, I better really closely monitor, especially when these cases come against Indians, because most likely they're probably guilty because the university passed or implemented a policy that applies only to them, right? So it doesn't matter whether you discriminate or not, you're just going to be assumed to have. Now, if it were just that broad category, well, you're going to get the benefit of the doubt in the way that everyone else gets the benefit of the doubt. But when you have a category that only singles you out, that targets only you out on the basis of your national origin or your ancestor, your ethnicity, you have a target on you.
Right. No, that's a very well made point.
And if I could just add that, Suhag said it beautifully about the example and how that kind of puts us like in a whole different category all by ourselves, right? But you don't, again, no one is condoning caste discrimination. And I saw some questions in the chat or Q&A about something along those lines. There is already a mechanism to address that, is our point. Okay, there's already a mechanism in corporate policy, university level, or in a government to prohibit discrimination based on origin or ancestry. That's already available, of which caste can be subsumed. Okay, so there is no need for this separate category as well. We need everyone to understand that. So no one is saying, go ahead and discriminate however you want. No, you just don't need the separate category that treats us like black sheep off to the side, okay? And that's the whole point. So the practical issue that you raised too, aside from the fact that we're now going to have people who've never known us assume that we are now some people that always act in some sort of discriminatory or hostile manner based upon caste. If you are a high-level executive or manager in one of these companies where there's a high population of Indians or folks of Indian origin, and you are just dealing with a subordinate who happens to also be of Indian origin on a standard, common, operational issue, and you have a disagreement, okay, and you need to discipline or counsel that individual just like you would anybody else who happens to be maybe African-American, Anglo-American or what, that person can now raise a claim that, oh, it's because of my caste, right? Simply because he or she's unhappy with the decision that was made. And these are the practical consequences of a policy like this coming into effect that a lot of our community need to be aware of.
Yeah, great. Excellent responses to that question. Now, one more thing here, clearly whatever the process that was followed to put this change in policy in place at the CSU, California State University, it relied on this this data produced by Equality Labs. Now that puts the data set the stage, and in some ways, it behoves us as a community to come together and perhaps create our own survey of some kind that can establish a much higher standard of evidence, while at the same time demonstrating the lacunae in the equality labs data. And that, I think, just to create a baseline database of some sort would be a sensible move on the part of the Hindu community on the whole. So any thoughts on that? Any move in that direction? What are you thinking about this?
Well, one, I think that we have a number of, so many talented and experienced experts in our community that have the subject matter understanding of survey design, et cetera. So we don't have any shortage of that talent. So if we were to pursue that path, I think it should be done in a manner that insulates to the greatest extent possible, the results from confirmation bias, from sample bias, and from all the other things that can plague data. As far as, I think more data for our community is important, because not only does it help us understand ourselves better, but it also empowers us to get the broader American public to better understand us. And it weighs in on policy, it weighs in on benefits, it weighs in on so many different things. So I do think that it's important. I'm a little torn on caste identity and things like that, where so I think it would depend on how the survey is designed so that it takes into account generational changes, even changes amongst populations in India, urban, rural, and decreasing emphasis on jati or community background, and also then tries to better understand how Indians and Hindus are organizing themselves or socializing here in this country, and where aspects of jati or other social markers comes in, and really providing layered context to the information. So I don't envy whoever would be putting together a survey like that, but I always think more information, so long as it's grounded in scientific method, is a good thing to have.
Okay, but what you're saying, it looks like what you're saying is you're not it's not on the table for you to.
We don't have, we don't have that expertise, but maybe HUA does in terms of scholars, because I think it needs to be done in a manner that's scholarly.
Okay, great, excellent. All right, so let us take a couple of questions from the Q&A box. There's about 22 of them. I'm going to select some questions, okay? Well, let me ask Ankur, our friend, he's from CSU. Have you experienced any caste-based discrimination in your life in CSU?
No, kind of in the same way that Soji and Nikhilji were talking about, people asking questions that are maybe microaggressions or ignorant and projecting, and it's just pervasive in the culture, because even like the Muslim Student Association or the Christian clubs on campus, right? When you're a Hindu, maybe you should think about coming to this and having all that. But I haven't had that level of, oh, you're a Brahmin or you're this or that, and that's why I'm going to discriminate against you or bring it up in that level. So if again, I appreciate the conversation. It feels like that analogy of dog and mammal makes so much sense, because it's just a part of the fact that we don't want to discriminate regardless. Yeah, but I did my master's degree at California State University, Northridge. So I got to take things like Chicano studies courses, Pan-African studies courses, and there's just lots of parallels into the way that indigenous histories have been erased around the world for conversions, right? For I wasn't prepared to speak on it too much, but I really feel like,
Sorry, I put you on the spot there.
no, but and just the last point that especially now with this kind of the woke left, right? They got boogers in their eyes. They can't see what's going on in terms of and it's nice that the erasure of African American history is being put on blast, right? The CRT conversation, critical race theory, and all of that. That's necessary, but they're using the same. It's like hypocritical and ironic how they're projecting the reverse onto somehow Hindus are erasing Muslim history. Wait a second, those 40,000 mandirs that were converted to mosques didn't happen peacefully, you know? Like there's so much erasure purposefully. And then again, this caste cudgel is just what we are, you know, preparing and getting, you know, proper responses for. And so again, I'm just glad to be a part of it. Thank you all for being here. And I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Okay. All right, Ankush. Sorry, I threw that question at you off without your preparation. So we're 20 minutes past the hour. You know, there are lots of questions in the Q&A, but I hope we've communicated enough of a sense that you know, just as we keep getting blindsided by this notion that, you know, as long as we are good people, as long as we are law-abiding, dharmic people, why should bad things happen to us? You know, they should not. Well, that was the way Hindus were thinking when the Muslims came in and when the colonization happened, and now here you are, yet another attack is coming our way, and you know, we need to be more cognizant of what to do about it, how to help each other prepare for this new wave of problems that are coming our way. Okay, with that, I'd like Ankur to just put up the survey on the, you know, how many of you have taken courses at HUA? If not, you should consider that. And in the meantime, Suhag and Nikhil, thank you so much for joining us today. Do you have any last words for our audience in terms of what you want them to take away from today's webinar?
I'll just say that, you know, we all have the power and ability to educate others about our tradition and what our worldviews are and what inspires us. And so, you know, yes, being dharmic is critical to our ability to advocate for ourselves, but silence isn't an option, not anymore. And this is creating generational rifts. And so we need to be open to having conversations with our children. Oftentimes what happens, sorry, my dog is coughing in the back, but oftentimes what happens is that, especially on visits to India, they see, you know, class differences, and they map on this thing that they have also internalized. So many of us have internalized this idea of a pyramid, even though it does not relate to our lived experience, it's still there. And so, you know, we can't blame our children from also doing that. And then they map on that pyramid onto everything they see, any injustice within our community, within our conversations. If you even say like, no, we want you to marry, you know, we're Patel, we want you to marry Patel, or whatever it is. And then they map on this pyramid, and somehow everything being about discrimination and subjugation and looking down upon. So we really need to be able to have conversations calmly within our community and across generations. So, and that requires us to know the subject matter. So I encourage people to visit the HAF website and also to support us, because we're in for a long fight and we're prepared for it.
Very good. Great. Now I understand where your dog example comes from.
Yes, poor thing's old. She's coughing, so I apologize.
Okay. All right. No problem. Nikhil, how about you? Any final thoughts before we close?
No, I mean, I echo what Suhag said. It's you know, what we're dealing with is a extremely important issue that we all have to be mindful of. But by the same token, we can't hide from the fact that internally as a community, we need to have some very serious discussions so that we don't keep walking into this trap that I call it, with caste now becoming used as a cudgel against our own community. If we're aware of what is going on and we can address this internally, we can work through it ourselves. But it's hard. There are generational differences, as we know. And anyway, spread the word, make people aware of what you've heard here today, get people involved, and at least stay on top of things through HAF, because they do a good job of keeping people in touch. And then as we need you to get engaged, I'm sure you'll get the call to action from HAF to do so. And certainly your help financially will go a long way as well. But do stay engaged, and we'll keep you abreast.
Fantastic. I will say one thing in closing, right? In one of the courses at HUA, we were looking at this issue carefully, and I came across some writings by some German Protestant scholars who never visited India, but who made a pronouncement that caste is one of the greatest barriers for the progress of Christian conversion in India. Because these Hindus, they are afraid of being caste-less, being sort of somehow being thrown out of their caste. They don't convert, on the one hand. And then there is this other terrible phenomenon that even after conversion, even after being baptized, even after being hauled into the church and converted and properly turned into a Christian, the fellow reverts back to his Hinduism. He just goes and puts a cross on his altar alongside his Lakshmi and Shiva and Ganesha, and simply goes back to being Hindu again. And it's such a misfortune. And this whole caste is the central problem that we have to solve in order to be able to convert the Hindus to Christianity. And in fact, the sentence, it rings in my mind. He says, we must open hostilities against the caste system. It is the greatest barrier to Christian conversion of India. That's written in the mid-1800s by a German scholar. So this is not a new problem. I mean, it's been going on for hundreds of years now. And this is the latest avatar. This is the latest incarnation of this problem. So for those Hindus who kind of gullibly believe that there must be some genuine issue in our community that we must police ourselves. It's also worth noting that caste as a word does not exist in the Hindu lexicon until it got introduced in the 19th century, basically, and then it starts pervasively occupying a center stage. And of course, the Ambedkarites are the warriors on this front. So we've got a bit of a challenge here. And I want to close by thanking Suhag and Nikhil for joining us. If you haven't completed the survey, please do. And we'll take it from here. Namaste, everybody. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Ankur, can you show the result of the survey? Okay. All right. Great. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Namaste, and have a fantastic weekend. Bye-bye.